Africa. Kalle udutsi hai. Samayado ipatlela sabo pino. Zuha uike.
Welcome to all our listeners. Welcome to the South African Budget, AU Summit, and Russia-Ukraine conflict episode of Ubuntunomics Podcast. This episode will look at the 2023 South African National Budget Review, the 36th African Union Summit, and the Russia-Ukraine conflict after a year of fighting. With me this episode is Sbu Nyati from Isakombe Assets. Hello Sbu, how are you doing this month?
No, I'm well, thanks. Yeah, it's a new year, and so I'm hopeful.
I don't know. I don't seem to share your optimism, especially not on the country front, especially not on the global front as well. There seems to be quite a lot of uncertainty, and we're continuing down the line we left off at the end of last year. But I think on that note, let's get started then on the essay update for this month. And this month we'll be looking at the South African National Budget and State of the Nation address, which I think are the most important things that happened during this month. Sbu, what are your thoughts and what are your sort of takeaways from this year's national budget and the State of the Nation address?
Well, my thoughts, yeah, gloom, I would say, but and then I would also say that before this budget, we obviously had the State of the Nation address, and the main theme was basically that South Africans are a hopeful people and they are resilient. So that's why I'm saying I am hopeful, but when I look at reality and what pertains in the country, yeah, there is that bit of gloom, and even this the Minister of Finance. When he presented his budget, he kept on saying that this was not an austerity budget, but all my progressive economics friends, the projects, the left-leaning politicians, any economists, kept on reminding us that this was similar to the budgets we've had in the past. Going back to 2012, we've always had these austerity budgets, and people in South Africa seem to think that the ANC remains under the spell of a neoliberal cult, and that the ruling party won't win next year's general elections if they continue with these kind of policies. So 2024 is just around the corner, and there's only one more budget next year, but there won't be time to change things. So there's a bit of there's we need to be hopeful, but there's no reason we should be hopeful. Those are my initial thoughts.
Okay, so maybe let me understand, what do you mean by austerity budget, and on what account do you get this as an austerity budget?
Well, an austerity budget, man. There's been all of these cuts, and these cuts come on top of the budget cuts that we had last year, and even this year. I mean, last year the government had received 192 billion rands more than they had expected last year, and we had austerity. An austerity budget. Even this year, we have an austerity budget, even though the South African Revenue Services collected 94 billion rands more. Because basically the reason why I'm terming it austerity is because the majority of this budget will be used to reduce the country's debt, and there won't be an expansion in social support, and there won't be an expansion in employment programs. Basically, the budget proposes to achieve a higher primary budget surplus than it was previously projected. Now, a primary surplus is austerity because the productive sector and households are taxed more than what the government spends into them. And so this is basically a great stimulus for the financial sector and the foreign sector. I mean, 75% of bondholders in South Africa are foreign. So that's what I mean, basically, that there will be less spent on the productive side of the economy and in households and the social support.
Sure, sure. Look, I'm inclined to agree with you if we look at a budget at a sort of overall level, because the planned budget deficit for this year is sitting at around 276 billion rand, which is equivalent to around 4.2% of GDP, compared to 292 last year, or 4.6% of GDP. So obviously, I think with the reduced, not necessarily reduced spending, but the reduced gap between expenditure and revenue, the deficit is definitely narrowing. But when I look at the expenditure, there seems to be an increase in expenditure. Obviously, these are slightly at the margin. And for me, actually, my concern is not necessarily on the broader spending, because I think what the Minister of Finance has done is taken a very conservative approach in terms of the budget, in terms of additional expenditure. But where one expects there to be additional expenses is on public sector wages, given the fact that the wage negotiations are still ongoing and they've not been finalized. And I think that, to me, will give a greater sense as to the final actual impact of the budget. But I think beyond that, my bigger concern is this pure, how can I put it, unplanned approach in terms of our fiscal policy. So, for example, what we saw 2-3 years ago was National Treasury issuing its own economic policy with very little consultation in other departments, and this created an uproar. I think this was at the time when former Minister Tito Mboweni was still at the helm. But beyond that, we seem to have completely abandoned the National Development Plan, the NDP. And so even if we are to spend more without a clear directed government program, or one that is galvanized actually all government departments around, we're not actually going to have much of an impact. But I do think that there is some room to commend, what National Treasury is doing in taking on some of the public debt, at least from Eskom. Although there've been criticisms that what the government is doing by taking on the public debt is creating more, obviously, room for further borrowing by Eskom, but isn't actually necessarily encouraging Eskom to resolve some of the inefficiencies and organizational challenges they faced with. And as a result, it's almost like they're getting a second blank check. But I do think that, that's quite a significant chunk. I mean, it's around $200+ billion, rands, that government is taking on in terms of the public debt. And if you look at our non-interest expenditure, it's increased slightly by just under 100 billion rand. And I would say a large part of that is due to some of the social programs and the expansion of the social relief, or the SRD grants, right? To the 350 Rand monthly grants, which have been extended. And I still expect government to definitely increase some expenditure when the wage bill comes in. And so for me, I think, look, the austerity thing is sometimes neither here nor there. It is also dictated by the cost of borrowing, which is why I think we're seeing a large chunk of government expenditure going towards public debt. I think we're definitely past the era of zero interest rate in global capital markets, and as a result, government is actually, paying a lot more for the debt that they're acquiring now. But also, if you add on things like our grey listing in terms of the task force on financial crimes, etc., this is also adding a cost in terms of our borrowing, not only for government, but financial services more broadly. And I think what we're seeing then in terms of the debt service cost rising and taking up a huge chunk of that public expenditure is a direct result of the rising cost of borrowing rather than the austerity of government. Because if you look at our public debt, that has been rising consistently, despite what some have characterized as an austerity budget. And so for me, the two don't stack up. I don't know what you think of this.
Yeah, well, I'd say that brings in what you've just said about borrowing costs. That brings in the South African Reserve Bank and their monetary policy. And what I would say is that South Africa chooses through the Reserve Bank what rate of borrowing, how much we'll be paying in debt. Because bond yields are set by the currency issuer, and we choose this year to pay 370 billion rands per year in interest. So one would have to say that's why basically the ANC itself it has been calling for a mandate on the South African Reserve Bank. But then we're not talking about the South African Reserve Bank today. We're talking about the budget. But then these things correlate. One influences the other. So yeah. That's what I think on the debt.
But I do think that our debt has also been driven by public borrowings, right? I mean, we've borrowed significantly over the last 3 to 5 years. I mean, the money has been coming in from the international markets. I think there were a couple of facilities coming from the World Bank, some from the IMF, as well as the AFDB. And I think that was huge chunks. I think somewhere around 6 to 7 billion has come in over the last couple of years. So I'm not certain that it's necessarily a thing of the borrowing costs alone. Yes, I think the borrowing costs have had an impact. But I also am not certain how you mean that. Well, I think let's not get sidetracked then into discussions about the Reserve Bank, because that could keep us here for the whole entire week. But bringing it back to the budget, what is your view on some of the expenditures? So obviously, the focus has been on the energy crisis, government taking on the public debt, government trying to open up the IPP space. There have been some who've actually criticized the role that National Treasury is playing through this budget. What we've seen is increasingly National Treasury making policy stances rather than expenditure allocations during its national budget. And that's mainly some of the interventions that were coming through in terms of the independent power producer, the relaxation of requirements there, and others. And although perhaps government may not follow an illegal route in terms of passing some of these policy interventions, but it definitely seems like an overreach in terms of National Treasury's mandate and powers, given the amount of interventions that are focused purely on policy that were pronounced in this budget. What is your view on this?
Well, over the next 3 years, the government will be spending 162 billion rands less on service provision. So this is a real decrease of 2.65% over the medium term. And what will be happening is that income taxpayers, the highest bracket, have not been asked to pay more. So basically what is happening is that even things like industrialization, the master plan that they have, and when we're talking about industrialization and export promotion, that sees a decrease of about a decline of 5 billion rands. And it's I mean, the 80%, the poorest of the population will be the ones that will be most affected through this budget, because households are under a lot of pressure, and I don't see this budget addressing our main constraints to growth. Things like employment. Nothing is being done about employment, and basically, even with this Eskom debt reduction, what is happening is that there are conditionalities that have been put on Eskom, that Eskom will not be allowed to invest in new capacity. They'll only be investing in transmission and distribution. So, which means the private sector will be coming in for more energy generation. So this will have a negative impact on the affordability of energy, because the private profit margins will give rise to the cost of doing business, because energy prices will go up, and moreover there's a risk that these IPPs that they are bringing in will not deliver the capacity that's needed to sort of like jolt the South African economy, because the energy crisis has affected a lot of sectors. I mean, I don't know, because because the way they have structured even this bailout, because it is a bailout. It's the conditions are. Uh, this is privatization of Eskom through the back door. As basically what will be happening is that the taxpayer will be paying off Eskom's debt, and that money goes to private corporations and lenders will be profiting instead of the general population, because basically what was happening is that we are socializing the costs and we are privatizing profits.
And for me, that's actually a big concern, not only just for Eskom, because for me, firstly, that means that some of the customers who can afford to pay, who would be paying Eskom or the municipalities, depending on how people get their electricity, will no longer be, part of the clientele or the pool of customers that that Eskom can actually supply to, given the privatization. And the privatization is also likely to start off with the people who have the most money. Ironically, though, what most people thought, which was that government would sort of reduce any of the obstacles and open up really for households and encourage households to go off grid, etc. What's actually been happening is actually an encouragement of the private sector to go off grid. If you look at the incentives, a bulk of the incentive, a huge chunk, are actually going to private sector. And for households, I think the limit or the cap is around 15,000 in terms of the tax breaks that people can claim on behalf of having to invest in off-grid energy solutions. And for me, that's actually just a bigger concern, not only for, Eskom, but also because with the availability and the sort of decentralization of our grid effectively, what we're going to have is assets sitting at a local level. And if we think, for example, the problem we've had with infrastructure theft and stock theft and cable theft, etc., as a result of some of the breakdowns that are happening in the country are bad, and targeting of Eskom, we're going to see matters get worse if people now can target firms in order to, steal whatever kind of infrastructure they might have there. My other bigger concern is the fact that on this focus on IPPs and generation, there's been very little spoken about the actual grid itself and transmission. Yes, there are plans to privatize the transmission and running of the network, as you've mentioned in some of the unbundling of Eskom plans, but these things need to happen simultaneously in terms of coming on of generation, but that generation being connected to the grid in order to supply the energy through the grid. And if you're doing one and not the other, you're going to have excess capacity that's not connected to the grid, and you're still stuck in the same position that you're in. It is very concerning. And again, these for me are the structural constraints that government needs to be focusing on. We should not be having a rundown Eskom that cannot provide electricity, or that's providing electricity at exorbitant costs. Already, the president has tried to stall approved tariff increases, 18%, which is supposed to come this year, and an additional 12% coming next year. And so at the same time, we're in a crisis that's actually pushing us down a slippery slope. Because once you don't have cheap and reliable energy, you're going to have an impact that's going to cascade into your industry. Your productive capacity is going to be severely affected. And already we've seen that this is also now spreading into other sectors such as telecommunications, which are also impacted by the lack of energy. Because, once the load shedding happens and it becomes too expensive for telecommunications companies to run on the generators, which are supposed to be backup, which then obviously, in the case of rolling blackouts, become the primary source of energy, they're just going to choose not to run those generators, or at least rely on a few towers which can be run at minimal cost. And we're already seeing that affect our telecommunications in the country. And, because these are network industries, it's ironic that the same plan that was put out by National Treasury 3 years ago spoke about this, and the interventions were supposed to be focused on these network industries: electricity, telecommunications, logistics, and transport. And yet these are the sectors that are in most disrepute, and nothing has actually happened since. And again, I think it goes back to the government's plans, and also speaks to the kind of legacy that our current president is likely to have after, the ending of his first term.
And the worst part of it all is that even his SONA doesn't speak to the budget. I mean, the president said that they will extend the SRD grant and they will use it as a basis to introduce the basic income support. I mean, that is the BIG, the basic income grant. But then a few weeks later, when the finance minister comes along, he says that the SRD grant will end next year and there will be no allocations for 2024. I'm not one that advocates for the basic income grant, but currently where South Africa is sitting, we need some kind of income for the 40% that is unemployed, and so this SRD grant, which is a tiny 350 rands, which 350 rands in real terms can't support a family or even a person for up to a week. So basically, what I'm saying is that this year, what they've done is that they've cut that SRD grant from 44 billion rands, which it catered for 10.5 million grant recipients, and they've cut that down to 36 million. That it means that 8 billion rands has been cut off, and then there will be no allocation for 2024, 2025, and for 2025, 2026. And people won't have that little bit just to and even then we talk about unemployment. Even the presidential employment stimulus, there's no allocations for that program for this third year in the medium term expenditure framework, because only in 2023 and 2024, which is now, they will allocate 9 billion rands, and then after that there's nothing more. Then it gets scrapped. So on the social front, they are failing on industrialization. They are failing on trade, on just maintaining what we've got, and just administrative stuff. Just all total. It's all gloom and doom now.
Yeah, no, it's very concerning, and I have a big worry that I think the country is backsliding, and we're slowly sliding into the abyss. And ironically, the rest of the continent is catching up, and some are leaving us behind. I just hope that we can get our act together, and before it's too late. Otherwise, what used to be migration patterns pointing southward on the continent will be pointing now northerly or in other directions very, very soon.
Even see, when they do things right, I mean, private renewable investments are a good thing, But then they go on to say they'll give a rebate of 125% to businesses, big businesses, and only 25% to households. And that will be capped at 15,000 Rand. And there's no cap for the big businesses. So they'll get all of their investment outlay paid back to them in tax rebates. And basically what they're doing is further encouraging wealthier households to go off the grid, like you were saying, and it will reduce Eskom's revenue going forward. And poor households will, it's all, they do things right, but there's always a catch even when they do try to do things right.
So true, so true. On that note, that takes us then to the Africa regional update for this episode. On that note, a reminder to our listeners on whatever platform you're listening through, if you're enjoying this episode, please hit the like button and share it amongst your family and friends. And don't forget to hit the subscribe button to keep up to date with all future updates from Ubuntunomics Podcast. For the Africa update this episode, we'll be discussing the 36th ordinary session of the Assembly of the African Union, which was the African Union Summit, which took place on the 18th and the 19th of February. Obviously, these summits are always preceded by senior officials and the Council of Ministers, which then process the decisions and table them for summit, mostly for approvals and noting. I think some of the key things that came out of the 36th summit are around the report backs on the various missions on the continent aiming at silencing the gun. President Cyril Ramaphosa reported as the head of the peace organ on the interventions from the AU in the TRC, as well as the interventions in Ethiopia, as well as other interventions in the Sahel and other parts of the continent aiming at silencing the gun. Obviously, the continent is still faced with some challenges given the global uncertainty and the ongoing conflict between Russia and Ukraine, which has had various impacts and different impacts for different countries on the continent, but overall has led to a rising cost of food and fuel costs. And so the cost of living crisis is actually affecting the continent more broadly speaking. At the same time, we are still trying to remain agile and deal with climate change impact, with the Horn of Africa affected by what has been considered the worst drought in 40 years. And these are just some of the key issues that were being discussed at this 36th summit and in Addis Ababa, 18th and the 19th of February. Sbu, what are your thoughts on some of the achievements from the AU summit?
For starters, President Ramaphosa's report must have been welcome because there has been some great strides made in the Horn of Africa, especially in Ethiopia. That war has come to almost like sort of like an end. And then there has been a lot that has happened in Mozambique. He reported on Tuesday, and the only region that is causing them a headache will be the Great Lakes region in the DRC. The eastern part of the DRC is conflict has not subsided. In fact, what has happened is that there is on both sides of there's been a lot of fighting in recent days, and so it's difficult for them to sort of like wrap anyone over the knuckles, because Paul Kagame on the one side, which is Rwanda, is a big figure in Africa, and also Tshisekedi on the other side he's trying his best. He's going all over, trying to garner support, but there seems to be no resolution of what is of that conflict that is happening in the Eastern DRC. Uh, because in this instance, there's no overt external force that has come in to sort of like that so whereby Africa can rally against. It's one of their own. Paul Kagame is almost is known as the. I mentioned Mozambique. They clapped hands for his intervention in the northern part of Mozambique, but he is also blamed for the violence and the military operations in the Eastern DRC. So it's quite difficult. And then there is the Sahel. I don't think the AU have got a hang of on that. I mean the Sahel region. The Russians seem to have gained an upper hand. Even Mali is emboldened. They are influencing even other countries like Burkina Faso, and nobody's talking much about the Russians in Central and West Africa. So there are those three contradictory reports. I think that they would have to that they had to deal with.
Yes. Look, for me, I think let's discuss a bit on the Sahel because this issue of the presence of the Russians, I think, is quite a divisive issue, and it's divided people, and it should be expected given the conflict happening between Russia and Ukraine, and obviously we've gone back to the Cold War type of politics and geopolitics, and for me, the way I understand it, and perhaps correct me if I'm wrong, is that the real involvement of Russia in the Sahel is largely due to these sovereigns actually recruiting private mercenaries such as the Wagner Group from Russia in order to respond to some of the terrorist threats that they're facing in the region, but also to deal with the power vacuum that's been left behind after, the multi-dimensional force from, was it France and other countries were pulled out. And I think there was also the UN mission, which also has had either a large contingent reduced or pulled out. And so there's this huge power vacuum left by this. And obviously, there's the still existing threat, which is in the absence of strong national militaries, which is why they needed assistance in the first place. These sovereigns are actually going out and looking for private military assistance. It's just unfortunate that it rarely is effective. As we've seen in Cabo Delgado, for example, they tried to employ Wagner and other private mercenaries. And it was, despite them having a contingent of these private mercenaries, that the insurgents was able to overpower the one site in Afungi, which led to a shutting down of the Total plant in Cabo Delgado. And it wasn't until the multidimensional force from SADC also getting assistance from Rwanda that they were actually able to have an effective military deterrent or response to the insurgents. And so it seems as though across the continent, it's never really these private militaries that actually help countries get out of the challenges, but these multidimensional forces that are actually much more effective. It's just that the challenge in West Africa and the Sahel is that either the ground forces that should come from the countries affected by the conflicts are too weak and sort of need external assistance, which is where the matters get complicated, communication issues, and distrust starts to develop. And, the multidimensional approach has not been effective. And hence, you're finding these governments then relying on the private militaries in order to respond to this terrorist and other human insecurity challenges in the region.
That's how it is playing out, because that's what happened in the CAR, for example. But I just don't think there is enough political will on the part of the AU to sort of like get their own army on the ground. I mean, they've been talking about this, but they've been talking about the AU coming up with a military wing, so to sort of like intervene. They could be coming into the DRC because the UN has failed in the DRC. So these problems are quite. I know I know there are issues with funding because someone has to be
Yes,
funded.
exactly. And that's where I was going because, for instance, the AU, they can't even fund itself, right? We've got a
Exactly.
problem of the so-called scale of assessment, which is supposed to lead to a self-sufficient AU. They've not even been able to fund their own political agenda. And now we can never expect them to have their own military if they can't fund their day-to-day and still rely on foreign, donor and development partners to fund the program. But I mean, this is a bigger, broader issue for me on the continent, like this issue of us not having money to finance our own development. And it's a huge problem. And it's the same issue that we're facing when it comes to the energy crisis. It's the same issue when we face when we're coming to the military response to the insecurity challenges on the continent. What do you think is perhaps a blind spot or a way out that African countries can take in this crisis? Because clearly, the fact that we don't have our own strong militaries at a national level is what's leading to the insecurity, which requires then either assistance from neighboring countries or the secretariats in economic communities, but also which is what leads people to then have private militaries. But then again, without having the kind of financial muscle to create a regional force at an Africa continental level that can intervene on problems, we'll always have these ineffective and inefficient UN-led missions because that seems to be the most effective response in the absence of a regional response, as we've seen in SADC and West Africa and other parts. But because not all regions have the same level of financial capacity, many regions on the continent still rely on these UN missions. In fact, the UN missions concentrated globally or here on the continent, it's the most number of missions than anywhere else. So how do
Uh-huh.
we get out of this? What is your thinking? How can Africa get out of this doldrum? And for me, when we're talking money, I don't know if I can accept the fact that we just don't have money. Um, because I mean, ultimately, if it comes down to it, like the money is printed, to be honest. Obviously, it's more about controlling the flows of money, such that there's not too much money chasing after too few goods, which will lead to inflation and undermine currencies. But ultimately, I think African countries can find innovative ways to finance their own development and their own security. But how?
No, I don't think it's an insurmountable problem here because uh, Africa is well endowed with all of these natural resources, and so if Africa had a proper leadership with the foresight, with the foresight that's needed, we could get around this. And one way would be to set up at an AU level, like a continental resources bank. Now,
Mm,
you, if you, what is happening is that these mercenaries come in and they are paid in resources. They are paid either in blood diamonds, they are paid in gold, they are paid in copper. The Chinese come in and they build infrastructure in the DRC, and they're building that infrastructure in the DRC with the DRC only pays them in resources. So if you had a resource bank, you could be able to pay for
mm,
all of these, uh, 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 um, whether it be human aid, it would be humanitarian aid, whether it be a disaster fund. You can be able to pay for anything because what you would do is just pull in resources, because all of these resources are traded in dollars in the international markets. So that's all. Because if you don't have foreign currency, but you do have you do have copper.
Exactly.
Means you have money. Yeah.
So I guess then it depends. I mean, do you see this as something which the African Development Bank should be pursuing? Because the challenge there then it becomes the fact that the shareholding at the African Development Bank is skewed towards external parties. Um, I like this idea of a resource bank. It's just for me. So here's what I see as some of the crucial problem, right? So the crucial problem is that although Africa obviously is well endowed, these resources remain in private hands, right? Those are the hands that can exploit the resources. Those are the hands that can export the resources. But because of the history of colonialism and the lack of development of a private sector, typically these private hands are not from the continent and they're external, right? Okay, this is neither here nor there, but the fact of the matter is that when our governments leverage or try to take advantage of these resources, the limitations they have is on providing licensing for private hands to exploit these resources, and they don't remain within public hands, right? And so what happens is the so-called wealth of the nation is not necessarily the wealth of the nation because it ends up in private hands and private hands which are from outside the continent. And it would be much better and beneficial for Africa to have a private sector, which, if obviously is involved in exploitation of the resources, would then lead to a development and a building of domestic capital markets. I think that's hugely the big difference between South Africa and the rest of the continent, is that obviously being an industrialized or semi-industrialized economy, we have got a substantial private sector in comparison to the rest of the continent. And as a result, those profits, which we not only make in South Africa, but the rest of the world, get repatriated and actually deepen our capital markets. And I think a resource bank could bridge that gap, but I'm still not certain how it could work. So do you imagine a resource bank that is a sort of trader in the way that historical marketing boards were in agricultural goods such as tea and tobacco, etc.? Or do you expect countries to borrow using their mineral endowments as collateral? How do you see this resource bank playing itself out?
Botswana is a typical example. You nationalize your resources, you get partners. The partner becomes a minor a partner. The state becomes, even if it's at 51%. I mean, countries basically, even if you brought in private players, you still get to tax them. So basically, what would happen is that all the legalities would be centered in one office, which would be the Resource Bank of Africa, and revenue would be split between the country and that central office, and you could get private players to come in. You both tax them, and you get a dividend. So there are many ways of skinning this cat. It's you just need proper minds to come together.
Okay, I hear you. My bigger concern, though, is that whenever I hear these plans, right, people make example. Oh, Rwanda did this. Oh, Botswana did this. These are small countries, 2 million people. I mean, the political world's neither here nor there. Like, you could definitely run a development plan if you have a clear jurisdiction and 2 million people to take care of. But what's going to work in Ethiopia with 120 million people, or what's going to work in Nigeria with over 200 million people? And so I worry that although I see the point you're trying to make, I just feel that it relies on so much political will that we've not seen up until now. And it goes to show, like, why we're here is that before people are going to be selling those resources to the resource bank, they will try to find a way for private gains, right? That's what's happening. And so I hear you, but I don't have any hope that it will ever take off. It'll ever happen.
political wills here. I mean, you made a good example. Ethiopia, it's a federal kind of a setup. It's a federal government with all of these splinters, but then they managed to get the population to pitch in to build that big dam for so that they can generate their own power. It is political will. We have to get as Africa to a place where we where our Africanness counts much more than our ethnicities and our small nationalities.
I agree with you 100%. I just want to add a little caveat that so when we think of these things and development generally, we think of them happening from a positive perspective, right? That it's the
Yes.
political will of Ethiopians that led them. No, it's actually the fact that they were isolated from capital markets, especially after the plans of the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam were being rejected, or filling of the dam by by Egypt and Sudan,
Yep. Uh-huh.
which then created an uproar that ended up at the UN Security Council, etc. That Ethiopia couldn't actually find financing to fund the thing, and obviously that coinciding with an existing culture of expatriating expats, from Ethiopia, sending money and remittances back home. This is already an established culture, but it may not be the same in other countries. But I hear what you're saying. At the core is really this issue of political will. True. Definitely agree with you that the issue of political will is actually what's important. But in the case of Ethiopia, this wasn't sort of a positive outstep that the government planned and had the political will and was able
Mhm.
to get the assistance of Ethiopians through um, just their patriotism. I think it was largely due to them not being able to get money from capital markets after the dispute from the neighboring countries became internationalized, and they were then forced to end up in relying on the expatriates, then putting money together to fund the program. Yes, it's positive and it's good, but I think it's a coinciding of all this and the existing culture of remittances being sent back to Ethiopia, which then allowed the government to take advantage of that. And rather than it being a positivist approach that the government took. So I wonder then what will be the long term trigger of permanent, I don't know how to put it, but the permanent suffering that will force African countries to take their own development in hand, because this is a serious matter. We discussed here multiple times, for example, on the issue of the energy crisis on the continent, that all these requirements on the transition, the requirements for renewables on the continent, given the contribution that the continent makes in terms of greenhouse gases, they're not going to be effective in reducing much in terms of global warming. Where we need enforced renewable investments without any further coal is actually on the part of industrialized countries in advanced economies, which contribute the most in terms of greenhouse gases. But because African countries don't have their own financing to develop their own sources of energy, we're relying on getting funding from development partners who are going to have these requirements set in place, because lo and behold, the issue of aid and actual development financing is actually more of an industrial policy for advanced economies that fund these programs, rather than an issue of how can African countries develop for themselves. So my question to you, Sbu, is what do you think is going to be the trigger, the last, straw on the camel's back that's going to force us to look inward and, finance our own development one day?
Well, I think it's already starting to happen. In that Africa, like in no other period before, is more connected, and you would be amazed if you had, you are into ICT, but the number of young people um, who are connected. I mean, I chat to people from Kenya, I chat to people from um, Tanzania, Zambia and all of that. And so, speaking about Zambia, what there was a political change in Zambia in the last elections. They are speaking about there being a big impact, playing a big impact in the Nigerian election, the current Nigerian elections. There's talk that maybe the ANC in South Africa will not get 50%. In fact, there's talk that they will struggle to get 45% because the young people are talking. They are communicating and they want change. And people are more enlightened than in previous generations. So necessity is what pushed the Ethiopians to and an incentive, because those people who invested in the Grand Ethiopian Dam, they'll get dividend shares. So it is necessity for starters. It is connectivity, and then the last thing will be international financiers, the global global financial markets. The people see Africa as the next frontier, so there is going to be much more finance coming our way because the East is competing with the West as to who will win over Africa. And the main thing is, as I made that example earlier, the DRC entice the Chinese with minerals, with resources, and everybody in the entire world is talking about the just energy transition, and Africa has got all of these resources. So Africa is resource rich. It has got the demographics, and it's the next frontier. So in terms of getting international, I mean, we've talked about this before. I'm one that is averse to getting foreign currency, using foreign currency for developmental purposes. But if you can afford that foreign currency, meaning if your local currency is not depreciating against the rand, or against the US dollar or the renminbi, or whichever currency will be the dominant currency in coming decades. As long as your currency is not depreciating, then you can afford that foreign development finance. So basically, there will be development finance. There is it's a number of things, as I've said. Yeah.
My biggest worry is this, though, right? I think for me, that's just a recolonialism, because the problem is not necessarily. Okay, so let's park the problem of industrializing Africa and put that as a special case, and say, obviously, the problem is that if Africa is to industrialize using external financing and is still not owned by locals, we're still in the same place. It's just a neo-colonialism, in my view. And my biggest worry is that and for me, it stems from what I've seen currently with the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. Although I'm an Afro-optimist and I always support African regional integration, the way we've executed on the Continental Trade Agreement was quite poor, mainly because not only do we, so at a national level, okay, so let's take a few steps back and say, how did other parts of late industrializers actually industrialize? Now we're talking Southeast Asia, China, Japan prior to China, etc. They industrialize on the back of an industrial policy, meaning a policy that's picking winners and losers, and a policy that's geared towards promoting exports, right? And it's through those exports. And obviously, if you're beneficiating your exports, you gain a sustainable source of revenue, and which is what underpins the currency. The reason why the euro and dollars, etc., are strong and stable currencies, and similar to the renminbi, and hence it's been added to the IMF special drawing rights currencies in 2015, is mainly because they've got sustainable demand for their exports and their exports are beneficiated. So as a result, that demand, cannot easily replace cheap, consumer goods or cars from China because there's just no other jurisdiction producing those cheap cars. And then obviously the fact that they provide most of the value addition locally means, those dollars remain or they get exchanged obviously into renminbi and they remain as, the wealth of the nation that's being tried. Hence, the Trump outroar at the trade relations between China and the US in some ways were founded given that, with a positive trade surplus in China's favor, a lot of the wealth is getting transferred. And, in the case of Africa, if we don't own the means of production, we may be exporting these goods, but the profits are going to get repatriated elsewhere where the headquarters of these companies are. And it's definitely not on the continent. So I worry that it really doesn't resolve this problem. And I feel like without a plan, we're never going to get anywhere. And coming back to this issue of industrial policy, at the country level, even South Africa's industrial policy is in shambles. It's not functioning very well, but at least we have a policy. But what I see when I look at the rest of the continent is I see a bunch of tax incentives, I see a bunch of selective, sector approaches that don't necessarily talk to a long-term plan, don't necessarily talk to beneficiation, but rather just promotion of exports and getting that foreign currency, because that's, as you rightfully say, strengthens domestic currencies. And in the
Mhm.
context of the African Continental Trade Agreement, there's no industrial policy. So we're not going to be promoting regional value chains. We're not going to be promoting local, despite all of these being captured, obviously, in the treaties, etc., as part of the objectives. I just don't see how you're going to do it without an industrial policy plan. And I hate to be sort of negative, and so in as much as I agree with you that yes, we are the final frontier, we are the final frontier of low wages, and really that's just what's driving this. It's not until we can develop an adequate domestic private capital and firms that Africa we won't benefit. We'll continue to be the exporter of our wealth in the form of commodities and the value addition which we may have if we don't own the firms that will be producing on the continent will be taken elsewhere. And that's why for me it forms a neo-colonialism in a way.
Yeah, yes, yeah, I agree with you, and you've also sort of like more than once come up with the solutions. I mean, you've mentioned a vision, no plan. You talked about a plan. It talks to the previous the previous point that we were talking about when we're talking about Ethiopia. We need a
Mhm.
vision. We need a plan. We need political will, and then we also have to sort of like you also talked about low wages. We must have some kind of like a trade-off. What will we have to lose in order to gain to get a bigger gain? Sort of like low wages for how long, or exports and exporting our resources for how long? But then all of this hinges around a vision, a plan. So, yeah, you've given the answers yourself.
I must say, one actual, excuse me, one point I want to add is that I don't think that our political culture is actually geared in the right way. Firstly, I applaud, how to say, I really despise the fact that we have such a negative relation to capitalism generally. Um, the spread of communism was really strong and took on the rest of the continent. And, as we're saying, these problems are not going to be resolved by governments alone. It's quite ironic that what I've been watching in the news over the last couple of weeks as we were coming to our national budget in South Africa was public generally saying, we don't want basic income grants, we don't want more grants, we need jobs, right? And everyone keeps
Yeah.
talking about government needs to create jobs. Governments really cannot create jobs. And what are the kind of jobs that governments create? They're generally bureaucratic jobs. They aren't jobs that are productive. it's only the private sector that can create jobs. And so we we have this sort of love-hate relationship with capitalism. Obviously, as the most exploited people on the continent, on the planet, we would hate the systems that led to our exploitation. But I do think that it's also through those systems that we can actually gain control of our own destiny. Because like I said, if we're still going to rely on foreign capital coming in to exploit low wages on the continent, and that's really the last frontier that everybody's talking about, it's still the same old for me. And it's not until we can realize that, private sector has a significant role to play, not only in patriating the value that we generate as Africans in the rest of the world back to Africa, but also forming the capital base that we need for our own development. And so we really need to have a deep introspection where we move away from some of these sort of political cultures that are actually holding us back, and this over reliance on governments. I understand, obviously, in the context of a very little or limited or non-existent private sector, that the majority of people will end up depending on governments. But I don't see our governments really being able to take us out of the hole that we find ourselves in.
Yeah, yes, yeah. Okay. I think maybe what I can say is that maybe Ubuntunomics must step up to sort of like what we are doing already, sort of like get to teach people that they are all forms, types of capitalism. There was mercantilist capitalism. There is there's the current form of capitalism is financial manager capitalism. So capitalism is not static, and capitalism is actually not the enemy here. You are right, and one of our failings as Africa is that we have not created enough champions. There are individuals who have high net worth, but not companies. We need companies.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And you're right. This is precisely one of the key justifications of why we started Ubuntunomics to begin with, right? It wasn't based on this view that, in African development, typically we either fall on one side, the communist slash East versus sort of the West communist, capitalist side. And really, these are leaves from external books, whether that's be the Russia Soviet bloc or the US and Western bloc. But there's nothing really coming out from ourselves. And I think this is precisely where we need to start charting these roles. And I think there's one little adage that I'm not a person who generally supports those guys who always say, oh, but China did this, China did that. But in any case, there's a saying that I like from China, which says, it doesn't matter whether the cat is black or white as long as it catches the mice. And I think that is the level of pragmatism that I would like us to take in our politics and in our economics as a continent, and not approach things from this ideological point of view. Although that's important, we need to be pragmatic and understand what is it for us, what's in it for us, and how do we consolidate our power and continue asserting ourselves as an African agenda, which is important because I feel a large part of the problem where we are as a globe, the sustainability issues we're faced with, is because there's a complete ignorance about the cultures and the contributions of places like Africa in terms of the global economy and global geopolitics. And the world has actually got a lot to learn from us, actually.
Yeah. Yes. Now we're talking about the African Union, the 36th African Union Assembly that they held. On the sidelines, on a positive note, on the sidelines were these commissions. There was the Aviation Commission that they organized, and it talked about contributing to a sustainable air transport and integrated and peaceful, prosperous Africa. And they had all of these people coming in from the African Development Bank, the International Air Transport, and basically they were talking about digitalized, sustainable, and agile aviation industry on the continent. The continent is huge, and so we need to transport goods and people, ferry them around. But then they were talking about things like aviation fuels that are sustainable aviation fuels, and they were talking about enhancing efforts to decarbonize the aviation industry by 65%. When we get to 2050. So this was all good, and I listened and I read, and I thought to myself, I think trains would be a better option. China is huge, and the way they tried to resolve their challenges was trains. Trains are they carry more people, and there's less emissions. And so and also they talked about this universal energy access. They also had another commission there, and they were talking about a single African a single African electricity market. These guys are thinking about these things that we're talking about. They say we need to fast track this universal access in Africa to energy. So there are all of these goals and visions and plans. Maybe these could also sort of like galvanize a new African man who is goal oriented and who is thinking development and and. So yeah, I just wanted to share that with you.
Yeah, look, I love it. We need to be thinking more of these things. But one thing I really just get so disappointed by is this little common thread of communism in everything we think of. It's almost like every response to everything must be communist. And I'm not
Yeah.
saying communism is bad, right? I'm just saying, for me, I think communism is good for the family, the household, and even perhaps a community. But when you start moving to a city, to the province, to a country level, this is where I think the competition among countries and the importance of capitalism comes into play. And I think we should be using both approaches. I loved some of the plans and discussions they have of the single transport airline market, which is something that was actually championed by President Kagame during his chairpersonship of the AU. But there hasn't been much progress since. I love the talks about the single electricity market, but again, if we don't have local firms generation, providing generation on the continent, we pretty much are stuck. And it's quite strange that I've only seen, so there are a few obviously industries which are integral. I think energy and telecoms are some of those. It's quite strange that some countries on the continent have actually got more external sources of utilities. So, for example, came across this Finland producer, Fartsila, which has about
Yes,
6,000
yes. Yeah.
megawatts of generation capacity all over the continent. And these are guys
Uh-huh.
from Finland. And I'm like, why don't we have our own localized utilities? And why do we even want utilities? I mean, such a strategic area. But anyway, the point I'm trying to make is I wish we could move away from this communist approach and response to everything and find ways to actually encourage a bit of capitalism in order to balance this, especially when we're talking at a country level, regional, continental level, because just coming together and forming, single, continental trade areas or single markets without having local producers, we're just opening up our markets to international producers and we're never going to get anywhere. And we need to be actually promoting local producers of a lot of things, starting, I think, with food and moving on to other things as we gain capacity, industrial capacity, and expand. But we really need to focus on local producers, locally owned producers, and producers who are producing for export in all of these sectors. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, there are all of these plans, and people they are saying that Africa needs $25 billion annually. to invest in energy, and they're saying that the World Bank is committed to coming in to help these countries. But then we are. It's not just about money and political will. There are also institutions to create and regulatory frameworks to knock together. So the World Bank says they'll come in and do that for us. But like you were saying before, we are all these 50, how many 54 countries, 54 different industrial policies, 54 different regulatory frameworks. If we were speaking about a one China type of thing, type of scenario, so maybe Africa needs to unite also. Sort
I
of like
disagree.
at
I disagree. I disagree that we need to unite on that level. Nobody says anything about the 36, 27 plus, sorry, European countries which have their own domestic industrial policy, which then gets consolidated in Brussels through the regional consortium. Nobody says that individual industrial policies in these countries on. No, I think that's what we need. We need independent 54 industrial policies, which I
but
think
they have the
need to then be
Shenzhen.
consolidated into regional policies. I think Maghreb's, ECOWAS, SADC, etc. Uh, I do think that you cannot operate at a level of continent when there's no states, when there's like failed states, and expect that continental level to cover everything at the micro level. I think
No,
that's
no,
where we
no,
need to
no,
be
yeah.
focusing
No,
on,
no,
is this
you're right.
micro level.
You're right. You're right. And we've spoken about this before. We need regions more than the continent. But the African Union's vision, I think it's 2053 or 2063, is for an Africa that eventually unites. But we have to get to a point where these regional bodies work seamlessly.
Yeah.
You're right. You're right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I feel like we need to focus on the micro level, and I think that's where the biggest lack of development is. We don't have any shortage of African leaders coming to articulate a vision 50, 30, 20 years down the line and signing up quick treaties. We don't have a shortage of that. What we do have a shortage of is countries that actually are focusing on private sector development, countries that are focusing on developing small and medium enterprises, countries that are focused on what value chains exist within their jurisdiction and how that integrates to the value chains in their neighboring countries in order to develop regional value chains. And there's none of that.
Yeah.
We just have these high level talks, which, yes, it's good. It's good for us to unite as Africans. But if we don't own, anything on the ground and we're just opening up these single markets, those who own in the rest of the world are just going to come and collect the pieces.
On that note, a reminder to our listeners on whatever platform you're listening through. If you're enjoying this episode, please hit the like button and share it amongst your family and friends. And don't forget to hit the subscribe button to keep up to date with all future updates from Ubuntunomics Podcast.
On that note,
Yeah.
let's move on to the last segment, the geopolitics segment. And in this episode, we'll be discussing the Russia-Ukraine conflict. All right, so it's 12 months into this conflict. What do you know? What is some of the latest that you've observed coming out of this? And what do you think are the chances of a peaceful resolution, at least in the next 12 months or 18 months?
I'll tell you, there's Zelensky and Ukraine going to the West and getting promised that they'll get all of this additional support. There is the United States of America, which between the US and the UK have contributed something in the region of like $55 billion, which is like 4 times as much as everyone else combined has contributed. So basically, this is an Anglo-Saxon sponsored Ukraine. And the Anglo-Saxons are very influential in NATO. basically people do say that the Germans are being pulled by the nose. And then you have a Russia who Putin has come in and said they thought that they would strangle us. They would strangle our economy. They said between 10 and 15%. That's how much our GDP would decline, and we've only declined by 2%. And he says we are stronger, and he's sent in his. We're talking about Wagner. The Wagner Group is doing much of the fighting, and the Russian army has been sitting back and sort of like watching.
Interesting.
Most of them, yeah. So, and then you have a China that is being provoked by the US, a China that is the Chinese foreign minister was in Russia just this past week, and he got a good reception. And then you've got this China Russia axis, if I can put it that way. And China a week ago said we've got a plan, a peace plan, and that peace plan has been rejected by NATO. That peace plan has been rejected by the US. You've got Brazil, who is acting out of terms when compared with the other BRICS nations. The Brazilians are more. I know South Africa says we are non-aligned, but the Brazilians are more non-aligned. And then and we were talking about, as I'm talking about South Africa, you've got South Africa with military drills, which hosted the Chinese and the Russians on our shores, and this has not gone down well with the Americans. The Republicans have come up with a resolution saying that South Africa should be. They are wagging the finger at South Africa. They're saying South Africa should be kicked out of AGOA.
And yes, they actually passed the legislation. It was last year. In fact, to respond to African countries that are finding themselves on the rest side, right? It's no longer the East, so to speak, West versus the rest now. And yes, so I think one of the policy actions taken recently by the FATF, right, the Task Force Against Money Laundering, etc., I think was a soft sanctions really against South Africa as a result of it.
Exactly. That's what it is. You can, if you read their statement, they are talking about. I mean, what do they call them? FATF. Their statement had more to do with the Russia-Ukraine conflict, and they're taken aside in the same way that the World Bank has taken aside, in the same way that the IMF has taken aside, in the same way that even the Bank of International Settlements has taken aside. So basically what you have is that all of these global institutions have taken aside, and they are supporting the West and this other bloc, which includes Pakistan and India and half of the ASEAN nations. So you've got a Russia that is saying we will build more roads towards China and through Iran and into Pakistan. We will be trading with this bloc. They call it a Eurasia ideology. So basically, Russia. I know. I've got a soft spot for Russia, and the thing is that Russia is trying to say we see them as these guys who stand up to the bully, But then as South Africa, what do we do? As Africa, what do we do? And I've seen that many African countries are aligning more with the Russians, sort of like they even this past week there was that resolution, and there were about 12 influential African countries which abstained. Most African countries in the beginning would just vote with the West, but now they're not. The Africa is gaining, is becoming more courageous to say no, basically, and that the Chinese are coming in with them. We were talking about development finance just now. Most countries on the African continent are saying that we get more trade with the Chinese. We do more trade with the Chinese. We get more investments from the Chinese. But as South Africa, we don't really. I mean, as South Africa, we have to be careful because most of our trade is with the EU as a bloc and the US. It's much more. Our biggest trade partner is the EU, and again, you've got the US that has funded our AIDS, HIV. What is this thing? Our program. So
our ARVP programs.
Exactly. So we've got to play it smart as South Africa, and there's no need to be enemies with either side, basically. Yeah, that's how I see it.
Coming back to now my question again, what are the chances of a peaceful resolution in your views?
There are no chances of a peaceful resolution. The only Medvedev has said it, that negotiations are currently off the table. The only thing that they will be doing is getting Zelensky to sign. But then when China came up with this proposal, with their peace proposal, since they are friends with China, they were willing to sort of like negotiate. So basically the Russians have got most of the Donbass and the Lugansk and the Donbass. So they've got what they wanted, but what they want is a buffer between the Donbass and Kiev proper. So they want to gain more ground. I don't know in a few months' time what will be happening. I mean, what will be happening? The seasons will be changing in March, April. So you'll get the thaw where it will be difficult for heavy military vehicles to move around. So there'll be a lull in the fighting. But then in the summer, I expect for there to be heavier bombardment of Ukraine cities, and the Ukrainians are waiting for more than 6 months. They will be waiting for more than 6 months for reinforcements. They're running out of ammunition, running out of all sorts of. Also, they don't have enough tanks. They don't have enough fighter jets. So Russia will be pressing on, and I think to answer your question, finally, the Russians have amassed a lot of soldiers along the border. And the Ukrainians are waiting for reinforcements. They're waiting for new fighter jets, new artillery, new anti-tank systems. And that will take some time to get the. Some were saying for the tanks, it will take almost like a year for them to ship them over to Ukraine. So in the next 6 months, I think this period between now and I would say their fall, which will be in August, will be a most critical period, because fighting will resume in the summer, and I think the Russians will be wanting to wrap things up by then, because I don't think they want to go into the second year of this military operation. So in 6 months' time, I think we will see some kind of like a resolution, because if Zelensky is digging in his heels, he might get toppled, I think, because the other factor that people are missing is that the Ukrainians have run out of men, fighting men. Yeah, you can't win a war without warm bodies, without people fighting.
Yeah. And look, I do think that the wick, right, on this proxy war, because let's be honest, this is a war between NATO and Russia, and the Ukrainians are just sort of the grass under these two giant elephants fighting. That wick on that proxy war is getting shorter and shorter, and it's almost going to come to an end. And my then question to you is, the thing about this conflict, and I think generally conflicts, is that hindsight is always 2020, and we may actually already be in a World War III and not know it. My question is, are we headed down that line? Because my thinking is the more countries getting involved, right? So, China, India, South Africa, obviously as BRICS partners, but also as people off-taking some of the exports that the Europeans weren't or had blocked due to the sanctions, are also now involved, right? Because also the involvement of Iran and other sanctioned countries, and also the expansion of BRICS as a counterbalance to the World Bank, IMF, Bretton Woods institutions, is actually snowballing this Russia-Ukraine conflict into something much bigger. And people speculating about China's intentions with Taiwan, and saying that if Ukraine was the test case or the lab for this conflict between Russia and NATO, it's probably going to be the same with China, Taiwan, and the conflict between China and the US, right? Because on both sides, they've committed, or China being that they're committing themselves to the reunification of Taiwan, the US, on the other hand, saying that they would defend Taiwan no matter what. However, they said the same thing on Hong Kong, and they didn't really cash those chips. So I'm not sure where we are at this moment. It seems as though we're just in a confusing space. And I wonder if you think we're headed towards World War III or not.
I don't think we are headed that way. I mean, the Chinese have been provoked countless times. The US has got all their warships and their carriers in the South China Seas, but the Chinese have not reacted. So the Russians are still calling this a military operation. It's not a war. So they've not brought the full might of the Russian army to bear. So all they're doing is just targeting infrastructure and targeting mainly military personnel. If it was a full-scale war, Kiev would be flat by now. So they're still calling it a military operation. It's not a war, and so there will be a lot of talk, but no one wants to fight a third world war. Yeah.
Look, I would actually hazard a guess that we kind of are there. But it's just difficult to measure, obviously, unlike the traditional war methods of military men, etc. The current warfare being involving economic warfare and sanctions, etc., is very difficult to compare and measure as to the extent of how engaged countries are. But look, I would hazard a guess to say, barring the military men and the involvement of military, this probably is a fight where the West or countries have been way more actively engaged in strategies, even though it excludes the military activity. I think the sanctions activity, and because also you may not be taking casualties on the field or the theater of war, but you're taking casualties when the cost of living is driving up in your country, when the cost of gas and electricity is tripled, when people are coming onto the streets to protest because of the rising costs, and you constantly have to calm them down to take on that cost and say, blame Russia and say it's for this, the sanctity and security of Europe. For me, I do feel though we're kind of in this middle stage, but yeah, I think only time will tell. I am concerned given the fact that you also believe that there's no peaceful resolution in sight. And then I do think that we're probably going to stick or have this conflict around for at least 18 months moving forward. And that just means 18 more months of rising energy costs in terms of, petroleum we import from the rest of the world, and rising food costs as a result of the impact on agricultural output from Ukraine as a contributor to global grain. So, yeah, it's very, very concerning.
On the economic front, you are right. It's a full-scale war on the economic front. I mean, you're seeing record levels of inflation. You're seeing supermarkets in the UK running out of veggies. There are no tomatoes on the shelves, and So you're seeing a lot of uprisings. I know. All of these marches, in whether it be in Germany or France, people are against this war, but it's just the elites who want to sort of like put Russia in her place, sort of. So on the economic front, it's a full-scale war. That's why Putin, in his last speech, spent a lot of time talking about the country's economic health, and the Russians have spent the past I think about 8 years since 2014 preparing for this, and so they've not run out of there are no shortages in Russia at all. So yeah, it's a very strange war where it's felt in the supermarkets of Washington.
Exactly. And it's sending central banks not knowing which direction to go. It's just a terrible time. Yeah. On that note, it brings an end to our episode for this month.
Africa, I love